So today we're very fortunate to have our guest speakers as Brynn Hibbert and Duffy from the University of New South Wales and Rosanne Quinnell from the University of Sydney. Now, of course, this series is about assessment, and in fact we're looking at the transforming of assessment. That's what we've called our series. And today I'm really looking forward to hearing about web-based collaboration in the undergraduate science experiment. So this is group and individual assessment and the use of the electronic lab notebooks. So Rosanne, Brynn and Neil, I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, thanks for that. You'll just have to bear with us with the technology. I just have to point out that Brynn and Neil's connections is a little bit, I think they've got a weak Wi-Fi happening there. So you may just have to bear with me, and we'll have to go to old school, maybe swapping the seats around. So first of all, I'll just give you the title. It's Web-Based Collaborations for Undergraduate Science Experiments and Group and Individual Assessments. It's a collaboration that's been funded by the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, and it's a collaboration across national borders. It's a collaboration across our state borders in Australia. So it's across University of Sydney, University of New South Wales, Curtin University in Western Australia, Southampton University in the UK, and Chiang Mai University in Thailand. And it's the implementation of an electronic laboratory notebook for undergraduate chemistry in the first instance. I've put this slide in here just to, I guess, control. Oh, that's good. So I'm doing two-handed operation now. Just to give a bit of an overview of science learning from secondary school, where it's very research-informed teaching, so it's all scholarship of learning and teaching, to construct curricula. And our exit point for our PhD students is where they do their own individual research. So somewhere between this point, secondary school, and this point, their exit into PhD, we have to introduce them to authentic research practices. And in chemistry, that's laboratory-based experiments. And so there should be at some point along here where we've introduced students to experiments.
Are you okay, Rosanne?
Yeah. No, I'm just going, oh, where'd the window go? I lost it. So this is how research is practiced. And just over here, there's a scientific method. We're scientists, so we examine the literature, we posit hypotheses, we test those hypotheses experimentally, and we critique our experimental findings, and we generate new understandings of the physical, biological, or chemical world. When we communicate those findings, we communicate them in terms of manuscripts, where there's an introduction, our materials and methods, our results are presented, our evidence and our inferences from those evidence, and then there's a discussion. When we look at how experimentally that's done, or our process, when we're doing the introduction, we're in the digital world accessing the literature. When we're doing the experimental world, we're back to hard copy paper-based laboratory notebooks. So really it's these particular places here, recording our experimental design and preparing our samples and doing the experiment, where we're probably not in the digital world, we're in the analog world, and then we come back into being in the digital world when we're discussing our findings. Is it that one? So I've over here blanked out the bit where we're actually back into the analog phase. We're no longer in a digital phase in this boxed part. So to be fully digital, we have to acknowledge that in this boxed out bit that we have to be, everything has to be digital. So the implementation of this electronic laboratory notebook was to replace the hard copy laboratory notebook in chemistry with this online blog. The electronic notebook that we're using was designed by chemists for practicing chemists. So it's using an authentic research tool in first of all, postgraduate science. So we've done a pilot with PhD students, and now we're mapping that back down the curriculum to undergraduate students using this electronic laboratory notebook. Part of this whole implementation means that we can have discussions with students and actually with all of us in the field about notions of open source, open access, having your whole lab notebook Googleable, which is quite confronting for a lot of us. And it means that we can introduce all our students to this notion of a global collaboratory. And it's very much wedded to the notion of publish at source. So the person who developed this electronic laboratory notebook started that whole phrase, the publish at source, being, again, very confronting for scientists. There's some other issues with an electronic laboratory notebook in terms of the machinery that's used. So a lot of the equipment that's used is proprietary software. And to enable that software to be read by a whole lot of other applications, it's kind of, we need to break that nexus that instruments don't generate some data files that can be read easily. What it does mean is that you could use a mobile device down here and access through the laboratory notebook, you can access your data. So you can access that data pretty well at any time. Part of this thing with the electronic laboratory notebook is that there's now a call for transparency with the data. So most countries are moving to archiving all scientific data, any data that's been generated with public funds, to be archived and to be transparent so people can interrogate that data. If the research was funded by public money, well then the public owns that data and they should be able to interrogate it. The ELN gives us a way to be able to archive small data sets. I'm not talking about big data sets. Most of the time those big data sets already have had a big chunk of money to be able to archive. It's these small data sets that students generate and people in chemistry and biology doing small experiments. The project that we did with the PhD students was really to interrogate the student-supervisor interactions. Using the electronic laboratory notebook, it means that the lab notebook is accessible 24 hours a day. A supervisor could be anywhere and be able to interrogate their student's notebook. The students may not like that, so it in some ways constrains what students write in their notebook and how they write in their notebook. The nice thing about it is that global experiments are now possible with our undergraduate students. It also means that students can have access to a whole load of other instrumentation that they may never be able to have access to. This is a screenshot from a Googleable electronic laboratory notebook for a PhD student who was doing biochemistry. And anybody could go into this notebook, and I've got the URL down here. So anybody could go into this and have a look at what the student's been doing. And Jennifer Hale was part of the very first people to use this notebook, and one of the research projects that's come out of this is how it was tracking her activity through her PhD. So pretty much where we're coming from with our ELN project with undergraduate students is, if our practice is changing in how we practice our science, so too should the ways students are introduced to the way science is practiced, particularly in the Web 2 environment. There are clear implications for assessment practice. It's a complicated thing. What do you get students to, how are we going to assess students as they track through this? And there are ways to do it with group work. So we can borrow from the peer assessment literature to work out how we can assess students, how students can assess themselves, self-assessment, peer assessment, and group work. I think I'm going to hand over to Neil now to talk about the actual ALDC project. So we're just going to do a big, Neil was just behind me there, so you will have seen him. So I'll just swap over.
Control. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. The ALN project we've got going at the moment is at using institutions around the world, as Rosanne has said, UNSW, Sydney, Curtin, Southampton and Chiang Mai. The object is to select a series of experiments. Originally we set out to do instrumental projects, but the Sydney Uni experiment is one where it's more of a synthetic project. The idea being that each institution will do an experiment, will then generate a data set, and the students will prepare reports, etc., based on that. In terms of assessment, how do we assess those? Assessment criteria across institutions, across nations, issues associated with that. So let's see, well, I just work out how we're doing here. Okay, so what you should see now is the experiments we've been looking at. So Caffeine by HPLC is an experiment that's run at UNSW. The students here would normally prepare a, based on MSDS data sheets and so on, a risk assessment. And the process we're looking at is the MSDSs, etc. The risk assessments are posted by the students at UNSW, and then students from other institutions are invited to comment on them. The normal process that would occur here would be that they would be done hard copy, and supervisors of the lab would then sign off to say that the students have done them and completed them successfully, give them feedback, etc. The approach with the ELN is that we will get the students to post their risk assessment, and then the member of staff responsible for that experiment will go in and comment on it, and the electronic signature essentially will be accepted as the hard copy signature. The experiments, some of them require the students to prepare a flowchart to show the work process, and again that's to sort of standard practice how we're going to go about doing an experiment, what bits need to be done when, and so on. So again, that is something that is commented on through the blog. So the students upload their flowchart, members of staff, etc., can go on and then comment on the flowchart. They might point out that students have missed a step or could improve their efficiency by changing things slightly. Once the data has been recorded, students obviously prepare a report, and then that is uploaded. The data set is then available to students from other institutions who can prepare their report. They can ask the students from the institution that have prepared the data to comment on any issues in terms of how the experiment was run, any difficult problems that they may have had, etc. They can also ask, obviously, members of staff. The changes here are that everyone knows how to write a lab report in a notebook, but when you're uploading things to the ELN, we need to make sure that the students get clear instructions on how to do that. It's just the same sort of process that we would normally go through. The Southampton experiment is the Beer-Lambert law, and at the moment that is set up so that the experiment will be done by the Southampton students, data set will be posted, and remote students can then prepare a report. Jeremy is working towards having that experiment as a completely remote experiment, so it actually can be initiated and carried out by students at remote institutions. And that's something that would be really nice for students to actually have some sort of ownership of the data that they're generating. The calcium by Flame AA is the Chiang Mai experiment. Currently there are floods, etc., causing a few issues with our Chiang Mai colleagues, which we're hoping to address. Mercury in fish is a UNSW experiment. And what we're hoping there is that we can actually globalize the experiment in terms of getting data sets on fish from the east coast of Australia, from the west coast of Australia, by getting the Curtin people to run the experiment, and also hopefully Southampton, so we actually can get data sets on sort of mercury distribution around the world, which adds an extra degree of, understanding of global issues and so on for the students doing it. It also gives data sets that you can do data analysis on, reliability, etc., variations and so on. Matthew Todd at Sydney has a WHO funded project where they're preparing drugs for schistosomiyasис treatment, and they're trying to prepare it as a single enantiomer. And again, it's an open science project, so anyone can get involved. So if you go to the ALDC website, which is at the top of the slide, then you can actually see some details of that. And if you've got students who want to get involved, feel free. It's open science. Okay, so as I've mentioned, the students got flowcharts, risk assessments, results, reports. The ELN is the portal. We can track what's going on. We can track student discussions with staff. One of the beauties of the ELN is that it is all metadata tagged, so it's all date stamped and so on. So you haven't got the issue of when things are done and so on. It's all there as part of the system. And what we need to do is consider how the assessment is done. Each institution, as I say, has got their own assessment criteria. Here we are going to be looking at how the students are assessed in different institutions, get feedback from our colleagues in other institutions as to how they might assess particular experiments, any changes and variations. And I think in this discussion at the end of this, we should talk about, does it matter whether they all are assessed in the same way? Are the international issues really a problem, etc.? So that's something we can work about. Talk about a bit later. Obviously, to get useful information, we will be certainly surveying students and staff about their perceptions. We're looking at group work initially here, not individual work. So we've got issues in terms of working in groups, how you assess that, do we use peer assessment, etc. Ideally, the way this would work is that we have all 5 institutions online at the same time, all the students lined up at the same time, and we'd all be working. One of the things we've found is to find in many research projects it doesn't quite work out how you would hope. So getting all of the institutions organised at the same time, their sessions in line, etc., has been quite difficult. So we're initially in our first round of experiments looking at one-on-one collaboration so that UNSW, Southampton would match up and run experiments and prepare reports, etc. Student recruitment, again, trying to recruit students. It depends on where they are in their semesters. What year do we target? At the moment, we've been looking at third years and master students. And as you'll all appreciate, staff, this is just one of many tasks and things they're doing. So actually getting all of the staff working together at the same time has been somewhat of an issue. We are making progress, which is really good. Rosanne's just going to bring up the ALDC website where we've been working with the ELN.
Just for all of the participants here, we've typed in the URL for the ALDC website in the text box on the left-hand side. So if on your own computer you click that, then that should open up your browser and that website as well. So you could be looking at that at the same time and exploring them.
Okay, we're just trying to bring up the ALDC website where we've actually logged on. So just that one. So hopefully you've got a window in front of you now, which is so what it does is the project. Most of those are we've done internal discussions, information, and so on. The important ones as far as students are concerned, Student Central. In Student Central, we've got, okay, it doesn't seem to be opening. Okay. Can you all tick whether or not you can see the ALDC notebook website?
If you're having difficulty, one of the other things that we can do is just get people to open it up on their own browser. Then you can just talk to that as well if you're having trouble getting it to come up in the window.
Okay, hopefully you can all now see it. I think we've managed to work the system out. Thank you, Rosanne. So what we've now got is...
Just keep going now.
All right. The various internal information and so on, some of them are set to Googleable. So project blog Rosanne is set to Googleable, which means everybody and anybody can see it. The other ones are limited at the moment, so you may or may not be able to see what's in those. So it doesn't seem to want to open and show us things that are in these, unfortunately. Unless it's opening in a separate window somewhere, which I can't see.
It's live in people's own windows, so if you click on it, it will open up in people's windows.
Okay, they can play. Student Central, general information, essentially that's access the introduction, course manual, and so on. And resides templates for MSDSs, etc., and risk assessments, and then each experiment has its own little home, and in there, templates for experiments, the actual experiment itself, students can upload their reports, and so on. It's just yep. No. Okay, where are we? I'm going to go back to that window. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully a little diversion hasn't got everyone too lost. Getting students, engagement of staff, as in any research project, at a local institution is always a bit tricky, but when you've got 5 institutions, managing contact, etc., is difficult, but we're getting there. We're getting there. As I alluded to, assessment. Each institution has its own assessment criteria, which have been developed for experiments over many years. How close they get to the correct answer, what is the correct answer. So the issues that we're looking at here, and it'd be nice to get some feedback, is should each course or uni simply do their own thing, and all we're doing is providing a framework where students from other institutions get access to experiments that may not normally be available to them, but the staff there believe it's a useful thing to do. In terms of feedback, obviously we've got this open science, publish at source mentality with this project, so the students will talk to each other. So if we've got different assessment criteria across different institutions, how is that going to be reflected in how the students view the outcomes and so on in terms of their learning processes. And I guess a question that sort of derives from that is actually how do we go about setting assessment practices across unis? Do we work between institutions to try and come up with a set of criteria that are then used? You get 2 academics, they're all going to have different views. It's not necessarily going to be an easy thing. Again, feedback very much appreciated towards the end. Is getting the right answer correct, or the answer correct right? Analytical chemistry, normally there's an experiment where you're trying to measure some sort of amount or some number, which in real life is particularly important. Amounts of drugs and various health products, forensic science, is there enough cyanide to kill somebody, etc. In terms of trade, showing that there is no contaminants in a particular material. So there is a lot of necessity to have answers that are useful. Because most of the experiments we're doing are analytical experiments, we do have a right answer. Again, samples are made up. Hopefully the technical staff have got everything right to begin with, so we know what's going on. The other issue there is that we've got students obtaining the data and other students then taking that data and manipulating it and preparing results, etc. So who takes responsibility for the data? Is it the people who generated the data, or is it the whole cohort of students involved in undertaking the experiment but not necessarily collecting the data? So as we've got here, models that we could look at is that everybody takes responsibility, because the people who are not recording the data or preparing the data are also going to be writing reports. There's some sort of quality control involved in that particular process, so yes, they are. Or ultimately, the responsibility doesn't lie with the remote cohort, but relies with the people who generate the data, and the remote cohort will be marked on how well they critique how the data was obtained, duplicate sets, etc., in terms of generating data, how statistically significant anything is, whether outliers are being ignored or not, and so on. So again, discussion at the end. Feedback would be really nice there. Okay, assessment. Obviously, if you've got a right answer, then it's easy to say, all right, you get in 2%, you get 10 out of 10, you get within 5%, you get 8 out of 10. If you ask a series of questions, then again, you have standard answers that you should be acceptable. And if you've got 5 points to get 10 marks, 4 points get you 8 marks, and so on, then we've got that. But in terms of working in a group, then we need to look at assessment by the peers among the groups. So if we've got a group of 3 or 4 students obtaining data writing reports at UNSW, we need feedback from them on how the group has worked together, how much information various members have used in generating that report, whether a particular student has gone away and done a whole lot of work on their own, and that's been included as part of the report, so they should be credited with that work. Peer assessment between the cohorts, so whether or not the cohort at University of Sydney believes that the cohort at UNSW have done a good job or a poor job, or whether they would look at different ways of assessing how the peers have worked together and so on through interactions they may have had on the web, how much discussion between students at the different cohorts has been incorporated into a particular report and how that's been acknowledged and how we go about assessing that. There is a lot of work out there on how you do peer assessment within a group at a particular institution. Between groups at different institutions, this is something that's rather new to us, and question, is it likely to work? And again, any discussion at the end on or comments would be gratefully received. Interesting to see how we go on that one. All right, so I've raised a few issues about discussions on assessments and so on. The standard experiment where you're doing an experiment that's been around for many years and so on is fairly easy to deal with. If we start to introduce collaborative research experiments at the undergraduate level, such as the experiment that is running at the University of Sydney, where different groups are generating different information, then there's intellectual property issues that can raise their head. So how do we go about looking at that if we're dealing with open science? Again, towards the end, in research, this issue is there, and I'm not sure how well it's been addressed, but Brynn can perhaps comment on that a little bit later on. But IP in any new work, any research work, is an issue, and it's an issue with open science. And the next point there, we've got shared experiments, start of collaborative research projects. Well, again, the project that Matthew's got running is WHO. It is a research project. It is something that undergraduate students can get involved in. Generation of new compounds where you may do slight modifications and then explore changes in electronic spectra, etc., where you might be making coordination complexes and so on as a shared experiment. Again, you've got research issues there. So if you haven't got access to multiple PhD students to do something, you may be able to introduce a collaborative research project into a senior undergraduate lab where at second year level you've essentially taught the students all of the techniques that they need to know as an inorganic chemist or an organic chemist. And you just want to take that a step further and introduce them to research, trying to get more PhD students later on. So again, how we could go about, or do you see that as some sort of value add that we can add for our students across institutions? As I mentioned before, in terms of the assessment, how do we go about managing any additional work by an individual? Not all students will do this, but occasionally you come across very motivated students. You may have a project or an experiment that motivates them to go away and do a whole lot of extra work. You need to make sure that that is acknowledged in some way. The sort of collaborative studies that we're talking about, experiments we're talking about, enable experiments which can have longitudinal studies, so that, for example, if we take the experiment measuring mercury levels in fish, etc., we can do an overtime study and we can do a location study, as I mentioned. So what about the fish in Sydney, Perth, Southampton? Are there any local variations? Are there any reasons for those? And do they change over time? So in terms of sort of whether mercury levels are increasing, decreasing, etc., over time by changes in industrial practice. Again, such a longitudinal study could provide interesting feedback. You then would have to acknowledge all of the students along the way who have done all of those. In terms of assessment, a number of students generally don't like people to know how they've gone. They like to be very private about their results. They are not happy about sharing how well they've done. The experiments that we're talking about here and the way we're talking about the feedback, it's open access feedback, so everybody can see what everybody else has done, and because we're working with groups, again, this is something that we need to think about, and this may be affected by the demographics of the students. Different cultures may have different approaches to how this would be handled. The experiment at the University of Sydney on preparing an anatomically pure drug, there are different ways of doing it. There is no right answer to an experiment. Ideally, you'd be trying to improve the enantiomeric excess as you go along, but you may do an experiment which goes completely the other way. It's still a valid result. So how do we go about assessing that? And the sorts of experiments where there is no true right answer, how do we assess that the students have become competent? What do we value in terms of those sorts of experiments? Okay, there's the technique, whether they've managed the sort of techniques, etc., very well, but then we need to generate questions that try and probe whether the students understand what it is that they've been doing within that process. Whether they understand the technique, the theory behind the technique, and so on. Well, I think that's all the slides we've got. I think that at this stage I might hand over to Brynn. He can act as the master of ceremonies for any discussions that might go on, hopefully.
Okay, Rosanne and Douglas, thank you very much for that. And I noticed you've actually set up quite a lot of discussion there, and I'm sure there's quite a few things that people would like to say. So if certainly if Brynn wants to be the MC for that, that's excellent. So
hello everybody, me again, or me first time. Thanks ever so much, Neil and Rosanne, for going through all of our stuff. Hope you've got some flavour for what we've done in this project. As I say, we've really built on the Southampton ELN, electronic notebook, and that was our sort of starting point. And we've managed to show, I think, quite nicely how it could be integrated into an undergraduate curriculum. So this is partly us demonstrating to the world what we've been doing, but obviously now we'd like to know and get some feedback from you about assessment, but also anything in the using this particular tool, I guess, in our now expanding undergraduate armory. So don't put your hands up all at once.
Okay, so if people would like to ask any questions, please just click the little hand symbol down the bottom there, and then we'll know what order to let you speak. And don't forget that you need to either hold down the control button or click the talk button if you're going to speak.
I'm sorry, we haven't sorted out any Dorothy Dix, so somebody's got to say something.
Okay, Jeffrey, if you don't mind, I might start the first one. I know I didn't put my hand up, but I'm just going to ask the question anyway. How are students responding to this particular environment, and are they making any comments or comparisons between this and traditional ways of doing these types of reports?
Yeah, sorry, I missed that because I was reading Penny's question. Have you been able to construct cross-campus groups so far? The answer's just about. I mean, really, Neil should answer this, but one of the issues of doing the trial of the ELN that we don't think we'll get when it runs in actual practice is that there's no obvious time frame. We've recruited students who've worked in often out of session and between sessions because they've got their regular work in session, and so the cross-campus thing has actually been rather difficult because of that. Of course, we understand that Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere issues and sort of time lags and so on are going to be difficult. But answering Penny's particular question, when this runs, the two sides of the collaboration, the two universities that are doing it will have set this up in advance, and they'll be doing their experiments on the particular day that they've allotted, and then there'll be the online collaborations filling in the gaps. I don't know if anybody can answer Jeffrey's question. Sorry, Jeff, I think we missed that.
Sorry, yeah, my question was just about the students and how they're responding to this different type of environment for the notebook, and whether they do they respond favourably in the sense that do they think it's better? Do they think that it actually allows them to do more than they can do other ways?
Well, I'll kick off, but I don't know if Rosanne wants to say something. So far, I mean, we've managed to do our recruiting, and I think the concept of doing this, it actually does fire the students' imagination. The idea that they're going to be collaborating with people on other continents and just outside their own laboratories is quite a neat thing to do, sort of anyway. We're halfway through the study, so we're going to be we've got various instruments, and we're going to be doing questionnaires and so on, and hopefully we can answer that question in a bit more detail by the end. But at the moment, it's a bit of a novelty. Of course, whether when it's rolled out in practice, students would just see this as an extra burden and another fag of something to do, talking to all these people in other countries, but I suspect not. I think they'll actually take to it perhaps even more so than our staff, our colleagues on the staff.
Okay, thank you. And I see Russell has asked some questions in the text there, so you might want to...
Yeah, I guess I've got a few points on that too, particularly with the cross-campus groups. Penny, I think you can do this synchronously, so there's two campuses at play, but don't forget there's going to be some data sets that are going to be left that anybody can dip into. So hopefully if we can get them to be open access, other students can come into those, and we can leverage off those data sets for students to be able to do data analysis and to write up the reports. So it's not just getting that kind of synchronous collaboration in place. That's kind of what we want to have in the first place, but we know that there is a life after that other people can use those data sets and to deliver some interesting experiments for students asynchronously.
Russell?
And Russell, I think that's interesting. I think the whole point that in my head of peer assessment and having group work is to get the peers and in those groups to do the assessment. That of course requires careful management so that they can look at each other's and give feedback on each other's work. So when we were doing the pilot with the PhD students, the supervisors were able to give feedback to the PhD students, and there would be this tracked dialogue between the protagonists in that case. And I think we could do the same thing with other groups coming into experiments to be able to give comments. So a bit like a discussion thread where the mark could be very similar sort of, I guess, metrics and rubrics for any other sorts of group discussion and peer work.
Okay,
yeah,
Helen, would you like...
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here, sorry. Well, please respond and then we'll get Helen to ask her question.
Okay, just before I move on to Helen, I was just going to say about the increased marker workload. I guess you're still only marking your students at your end who are doing the experiment that they would be doing. I think as we've suggested in some of the slides, I think you've got to think a bit more carefully about the way you mark. So I don't think there'll be any more workload per se, but we might have to be a bit smarter in the way that we do the marking. Helen. Helen?
Oh, yes.
You put your hand up.
Helen, just make sure you keep your finger on either the control button or click the talk button so that we're able to hear you.
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me? No.
Yes, thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. There are just a few things that really, I think what you touch on is really important about the challenges, even if we're going to be doing cross-disciplinary work. So I think that's really important. I'm interested to have about the assessment when there's no particular right answer. And was just thinking about, have you actually done any of that assessment yet?
No.
Okay. And I was wondering within your experiments whether an approach would be that when there's no right answer, that there needs to be a justification of why they did what they did. And it brings to mind a lot of what happens in medicine even, because even in that arena, there's normally not the right answer as well. And it's about the justification, I guess, as to why they did what they did. And just while I have your attention, I guess, I'm wondering also, how much could you upscale this? What would you anticipate? Thanks.
Okay, good-o. Yeah, thanks, Helen. This business about assessment when there's no right answer is, it's probably 99% of all assessments is a bit like that anyway, isn't it? I mean, there's very little certainty in life. You know, there might be some mathematical sort of theorems you can derive or something that gives you an absolute right answer. But in the sciences, there's always the interpretation. There's issues with the experiment itself. But as I said, that's really then comes back on us when we're designing experiments. Students feel happy if they think there is a goal and that they've got somewhere that we think they should have got to. So a right answer might be getting a result with quite a wide tolerance on the actual figures, but actually getting to the end of the experiment and getting something out and so on. So, and this kind of ELN collaboration per se won't change that. I guess there'll be an issue of trying to assess the collaboration. So is the whole greater than the sum of the parts, and therefore should we be looking for assessing the ELN group as a whole rather than doing the individual bits, which might be something to think about. What was Helen's other question? What was your other question?
The upscaling. How much do you think you can upscale it?
Sorry, Helen. It's surprising how quickly you forget what people have just said to you. Okay, upscaling in terms of the size of an ultimate collaboration. When we first put this to ALDC, I had this grand design where the five institutions that are part of the collaboration would somehow simultaneously share results between all cohorts, more or less, all at the same time. And so we'd get the one institution doing the experiment and the four sharing the results and collaborating, and it was all going to be marvelous. In practice, if we can just get two institutions talking to each other, we feel very pleased with ourselves. So my guess is upscaling where you have three-way collaborations, four-way collaborations are maybe few and far between. What might happen, though, is that you'll get a rolling upscale, like is happening, I think, with Matt Todd's experiment at Sydney. So in a way, he's already had this going as a collaboration, and our ELN has just joined in with a whole bunch of other people. So I think if you can get the experiment right, it might grow like Topsy and then be this wonderful large-scale job. With individual sort of afternoon lab experiments that we're very familiar with at the moment, my guess is you'll tend to do it on a one-on-one. And of course, one of the things we haven't really discussed is the benefit to the developing world countries that this might deliver. So Chiang Mai is certainly I don't know what we call it, second world perhaps. They have good facilities, but probably not quite as good as some of the ones in Australia or the ones in Southampton. And so we're trying to see how we can fill in gaps in their curriculum by this kind of collaboration. So in some ways you can tailor the collaboration either between two institutions that are perhaps on a par and might even be able to do the experiments at both ends, and also with an institution, say, like UNSW, and then one like Chiang Mai, where we're hoping that we can use our equipment to the benefit of their students. I think I see Jim.
Yes, I'm here, Brynn. I'm just interested in the comparability issues, particularly when you're looking at in assessment criteria between institutions.
Yeah, and that's something I think we flagged and we would worry about. I'm not absolutely sure how well we're going to probe that in this trial. I think what eventually will happen is just merely getting it to work and out the other end. I think what we're finding is it's very difficult to provide what we might call an authentic experience that we can then really look at and say, well, did the assessment work and so on, because I think we've found that the students are doing it knowing it's a trial, so then we don't mark them in quite the same way as we would if it was then heading towards their degree and so on. So actually that's a very good question, and I'm not totally sure if it's one I can answer at this stage. Rosanne's just pointed out that the survey that we're doing and the instruments are also going to staff, and one of the questions for them is, what did they see? How did it go for them? Did they see it as a good experience, and did they feel that they'd been able to assess properly and so on? But this business of comparability, I think, is an interesting one. And of course, this is what's happening. In the old days, nobody cared because we were all in our little silos and we assessed away like mad, and our students got their degrees. And we all know a first from one institution isn't necessarily of equivalent standing as a degree or first from another institution. So perhaps this kind of collaboration just might start to force us to do those comparisons and to think a bit about it. I can't see it coming out of this particular trial, but I think we've started off the rot, as it were.
Yeah, I'd welcome your thoughts, and thank you very much, Sean. I must confess I'm not in the science discipline, I'm in management, and I'm playing around with this issue of standards. And I agree with everything you've said and the sentiment which it was said too in terms of knowledge silos, etc. But it seems to me if we are embarking upon synergistic practice, collaborating with institutions, there needs to be some level of coherency. And I hear that you're saying, yes, that's true. But in terms of our practice as academics, there's also has to be not only consistency and coherency, and we're aiming for transparency, but this business about reliability and validity, ultimately, at the end of the day. I express it in terms of seeking for standards and trying to identify benchmarks when it comes to relative differences in assessment practice.
Oh, marvellous. Rosanne had just written benchmarking on my bit of paper here, so obviously you've found a soulmate there. No, absolutely right. I have a lot to do. I'm a chemist and have a lot to do with international standards organisations, ISO and IUPAC, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, and we spend a lot of time trying to get that kind of comparability between nations, mostly for trade purposes and health and all those sorts of things. But education is in a sense no different here, and you're absolutely right. I think that's going to be quite an interesting thing that comes out. While I've got the mic, sorry, I've just noticed Russell has asked, has there been a notable cultural difference in the etiquette of student comments between the institutions? Probably to answer that is we don't have enough data yet to really understand. Everybody seems to be very polite is all I can say.
Just coming back to the issue of comparability momentarily, if I can, Brynn, there's only one institution that I saw that did comparability to an exhaustive level, and that was the University of Cambridge. I had the fortune or misfortune many years ago to do a TEFL course, and they flew comparability or moderators or assessors around the world to completely go through whatever was happening at an institution or at an agency like a dose of salts. They went through everything, how things were taught, how the students were responding, and it was a training institution rather than an educational institution. So I was absolutely fascinated by the degree of interest they had in everything. They went through the accounts, the whole lot. I was quite amazed.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. I should actually say, as part of the ALDC grant, Neil Duffy will visit all the institutions in our collaboration, both to get feedback on the ground and also to really drill down and see how it's all working. So when he's done his little tour, we might be able to answer some of those questions.
Now, I noticed there was one question there in the text, again from Russell, I think it was. Yes, so have you picked that one up?
Yeah, I just talked about the cultural differences. As I say, at the moment, we don't have enough data really to say. I made the comment that just everybody was very polite with each other. The Brynn on the comment is in fact Rosanne, who's using my computer. Okay, if there are any more questions, I'd wrap us up, Jeffrey. Hello. Hello, everybody. Is anybody there? Oh, clapping. Oh, thank you. Yes. Oh. As you can see, this is the first time we've done this, so the fact that anybody's heard anything at all is an absolute miracle. I could say we were about an hour ago. We were sitting here saying, "No, you pressed that button." No, I don't think so. Yes. So anyway, it's been an interesting opportunity for us, as I say. So thank you to Jeffrey and Matthew for organising us, and hopefully we can do it again next century.
Okay, I just want to say thank you to Brynn, Douglas and Rosanne for being with us tonight. Thank you very much for giving us that presentation. It was very interesting, and I'm sure people will go away and reflect on that, because we certainly do have to have a look at the new ways that we need to be able to assess students, and that's what the Transforming Assessment webinar series has been about. It's about giving people new insights, something to reflect on, something to think about. Now, Matthew has just put up the survey there, so people, before you run away, if you wouldn't mind filling out the survey for us, because it always helps. It's good feedback for the presenters, and it's always good if there's any improvements that we need to make to the process around our webinars as well. And just to remind you, there's a number of questions there, and you'll need to scroll down to be able to answer all the questions and then to be able to submit. There's a submit button at the bottom, so Matthew's just reminded everyone in the text. And of course, we do have one more webinar in the program for 2011. That's in December, and if you go to our Transforming Assessment website, you'll be able to see the details on that. Matthew and I will sit down and work out a program for 2012. So yes, we will continue the webinar series next year. And again, Brynn, Douglas, and Rosanne, thank you very much for your time tonight. And of course, while people are filling out the survey, if there are any questions that you've still got, or you can put that in as text, or you can put your hand up and we'll continue conversation for just a couple of minutes while people fill that out. Otherwise, we'd like to say thank you very much. And Matthew, perhaps if we could probably stop the recording now.
Okay, thanks heaps to everybody. So we will be here for about 30 seconds before we dash off to the pub.
If I could put a virtual drink through there, I'd actually offer you a thank you drink.